This is Cynthia Ganga, Soprano with Cynthia Sings Classical. I am reading Day 2, the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Volume 1, Canada's Residential Schools, The History, Part 1, Origins to 1939. I'm going to turn the page a little bit so that you guys can actually read it while I'm reading it, because I found that in the last reading, it wasn't close enough to be able to read it. So, and Canada separated children from their parents, sending them to residential schools. This was not done to educate them, but primarily to break their link to their culture and identity. These measures were part of a coherent policy to eliminate Aboriginal people as distinct peoples and to assimilate them into the Canadian mainstream against their will. Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs Duncan Campbell Scott outlined the goals of that policy in 1920 when he told a parliamentary committee that our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. These goals were reiterated in 1969 in the federal government's Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy, more often referred to as the White Paper, which sought to end Indian status and terminate the treaties that the federal government had negotiated with First Nations. The Canadian government pursued this policy of cultural genocide because it wished to divest itself of its legal and financial obligation to Aboriginal people and gain control over their land and resources. If every Aboriginal person had been absorbed into the body politic, there would be no reserves, no treaties, and no Aboriginal rights. Residential schooling quickly became a central element in the federal government's Aboriginal policy. When Canada was created as a country in 1867, Canadian churches were already operating a small number of boarding schools for Aboriginal people. As settlement moved westward in the 1870s, Roman Catholic and Protestant missionaries established missions and boarding schools across the prairies, in the north, and in British Columbia. Most of these schools received small, per-student grants from the federal government. In 1883, the federal government moved to establish 3 large residential schools for First Nations children in Western Canada. In the following years, the system grew dramatically. According to the Indian Affairs Annual Report for 1930, there were 80 residential schools in operation across the country. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement provided compensation to students who attended 139 residential schools and residencies. The federal government has estimated that at least 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students passed through the system. Roman Catholic, Anglican, United Methodist, and Presbyterian churches were the major denominations involved in the administration of the residential school system. The government's partnership with the churches remained in place until 1969, and although most of the schools had closed by the 1980s, the last federally supported residential schools remained in operation until the 1990s. For children, life in these schools was lonely and alien. Buildings were poorly located, poorly built, and poorly maintained. The staff was limited in numbers, often poorly trained and not adequately supervised. Many schools were poorly heated and poorly ventilated, and the diet was meager and of poor quality. Discipline was harsh, and daily life was highly regimented. Aboriginal languages and cultures were denigrated and suppressed. The educational goals of the schools were limited and confused, and usually reflected a low regard for the intellectual capabilities of Aboriginal people. For the students, education and technical training too often gave way to the drudgery of doing the chores necessary to make the schools self-sustaining. Child neglect was institutionalized, and the lack of supervision created situations where students were prey to sexual and physical abusers. In establishing residential schools, the Canadian government essentially declared Aboriginal people to be unfit parents. Aboriginal parents were labeled as being indifferent to the future of their children, a judgment contraindicated by the fact that parents often kept their children out of schools because they saw those schools, quite accurately, as dangerous and harsh institutions that sought to raise their children in alien ways. Once in the schools, brothers and sisters were kept apart, and the government and churches even arranged marriages for students after they finished their education. Despite the coercive measures that the government adopted, it failed to achieve its policy goals. Although Aboriginal peoples and cultures have been badly damaged, they continue to exist. Aboriginal people have refused to surrender their identity. It was the former students, the survivors of Canada's residential schools, who placed the residential school issue on the public agenda. Their efforts led to negotiation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement that mandated the establishment of the Residential School Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The Commission's final report is divided into the following volumes. Volume 1, The History. Volume 2, The Inuit and Northern Experience. Volume 3, The Métis Experience. Volume 4, Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. Volume 5, The Legacy. Volume 6, Reconciliation. The first volume, The History, is divided into 3 sections, and due to its length is being published in 2 parts. The first section places residential schooling for Indigenous people in historical context and examines the pre-Confederation roots of the Canadian residential school system. The second section describes the history and the student experience of residential schools from Confederation to 1939. This was the period in which the system was established and expanded. It was also the period of the most intense health crisis. By the end of the 1930s, government officials had come to question the value of the residential school system. The final section covers the years from 1940 to 2000, by which time the system had been brought to an end. The volumes, The Inuit and Northern Experience and the Métis Experience, addresses topics that are often ignored in the discussion of residential schooling. The 1950s saw a dramatic expansion of residential schooling in northern Canada and the creation of a system in which Inuit children were sent to residences that could be hundreds of kilometers away from their home communities. Constant changes in government policies meant that at some times Métis children were barred from residential schools, while at other times residential schools were the only schools that would accept Métis children. The Missing Children and Unmarked Burials report addresses 3 interrelated questions that were added to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's mandate. How many children died at the schools? What were the conditions that led to their deaths? And where were they buried? The report demonstrates that Aboriginal residential school students died at rates higher than non-Aboriginal students. It also demonstrates that the government failure to provide adequate funding, medical treatment, nutrition, housing, sanitation, and clothing contribute to this elevated death rate. In addition, the report makes it clear that the government had been advised of the implications of its policies and presented with options, which it chose to ignore, that would have reduced the school death rates. The Legacy volume examines the devastating effects the residential school system has had on former students, their families, and on Canadian society as a whole. It explores the loss of language and culture suffered by Aboriginal people, as well as the significant gaps they experience in health, education, and employment outcomes. The Legacy volume also analyzes in depth the dramatic overrepresentation of Aboriginal Canadians in the child welfare and correctional systems. In each of the volume's 5 sections, the commissioners present a series of calls to action intended to address the injustices and inequities that are the legacy of the residential school system and the long-standing policies of assimilation that gave birth to it. The Reconciliation volume establishes guiding principles and a framework for advancing reconciliation in Canadian society. It identifies the challenges that must be overcome if reconciliation is to flourish in the 21st century, and highlights the critical role that Aboriginal people's cultures, histories, and laws must play in the reconciliation process. The volume demonstrates that although apologies from Canada and the churches were important symbolic events, reconciliation also requires concrete measures to repair the damaged relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown, and to establish respectful relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. Individual chapters in the volume examine the potential for Indigenous law, public education, dialogue, the arts, and commemoration, and Canadian society more broadly to contribute to reconciliation. Based on these findings, the Commission makes specific calls to action that, when implemented, will ensure that reconciliation has a strong foundation in Canada moving into the future. The historical context for Canada's residential schools. Chapter 1, Colonialism in the Age of Empire. The whole part of the residential school was the part of a bigger scheme of colonization. There was intent. The schools were there with the intent to change people, to make them like others, and to make them not fit. And today, you know, we have to learn to decolonize. Shirley Flowers' statement to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. In 1933, an Anglican missionary described the All-Saints School in Aklavik in the Northwest Territories as the most northerly residential school in the British Empire. This proud claim is a reminder that Canada's residential school system was part of a global imperial process that brought states and Christian churches together in a complex and powerful fashion. The men and women who established the school celebrated this link between their work and the growth of European empires. The spread of those empires, the modern age of imperialism, was set in motion in the 15th century when the voyages of maritime explorers revealed potential sources of new wealth to the monarchs of Europe. By the 1440s, the Portuguese had reached the Gulf of Guinea. Soon they were bringing slaves, gold, enslaved people, gold and ivory from Africa to Europe. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and the Incas gave Spain, and ultimately all of Europe, access to the precious metals of North and South America. This not only enriched the Old World, it also unleashed an unceasing wave of migration, trade, conquest, and colonization. It marked the beginning of the creation of a European-dominated global economy. Although it was led initially by Spain and Portugal, this era of imperial expansion came to be directed by Holland, France, and in the end, most spectacularly by Britain. The Age of Empire saw powerful European states gain control of other people's lands throughout the world. It was an era of mass migration. Millions of Europeans came as colonial settlers to nearly every part of the world. Millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic Ocean in the European-led enslaved people trade, in which coastal Africans collaborated. Traders from India and China spread throughout the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, bringing with them servants, indentured servants, whose lives were little different from those of slaves. The activities of explorers, farmers, prospectors, trading companies, or missionaries often set the stage for expansionary wars, the negotiation and breaking of treaties, attempts at cultural assimilation, and the exploitation and marginalization of the original inhabitants of the colonized lands. To a large extent, the colonists were extending beyond their own borders and social values they had practiced at home. In England's case, for example, during the transition away from feudalism in the 14th century, landlords seeking to benefit from new, more efficient farming practices forced hundreds of thousands of peasants off their land and then did the same thing in the conquered colonies of Ireland and Scotland. Since, by British standard, Indigenous people were not using land as productively as possible, the colonizers, acting under British laws and British conceptions of possession, believed that they had the right to the land wherever they took measures to improve it. Although the formal European empires finally collapsed in the last half of the 20th century, their legacy remains. It is visible in the unequal distribution of global resources, in the civil wars that have marked the histories of many former colonies, and in the social, economic, educational, and health conditions of peoples whose lands have been colonized. On one day, in February 2012, in the international news were stories of Malaysians protesting the opening of an Australian refinery in their country, the working conditions in an American computer plant in China, the killing of American soldiers in Afghanistan, the impact of tourism on indigenous peoples in the Amazon, and controversy over British oil exploration in Somalia. Each of these stories is but the latest event in a worldwide story with an imperial pedigree. Canada is also the product of its history. It was initially colonized by the French Empire and was one of the prizes in the lengthy inter-imperial conflict between France and Britain. Once established as a state in 1867, it remained part of the British Empire. In its westward and northern expansion, Canada wrote its own chapters in the history of colonialism, albeit with continued investments from British and later from the United States. The relationship between the colonists and indigenous peoples is long and complex, reflecting changes in the interests of both and shifts in the balance of power. Throughout their encounter, both colonizer and colonized pursued their own, often changing goals. At the beginning of this period is what is now Canada. Aboriginal peoples were in a dominant position. Not only were the European newcomers outnumbered, they also counted on Aboriginal people for their very survival. Their journeys of exploration depended on the support of Aboriginal guides. The fur trade, the major European economic activity in the region, could not have functioned without Aboriginal labor. Aboriginal people, for their part, valued many of the new trade goods and engaged in a complex set of diplomatic relations with both French and English colonial powers. In the end, however, the experience of Aboriginal people in Canada had much in common with that of indigenous peoples in other colonized lands throughout the world. As the balance of power shifted, their rights to land and self-government were brushed aside, and they were pushed onto reserves and cut off from participation in the dynamic sectors of the economy. This colonial history has profoundly shaped Canada's political, cultural, and national identity, and continues to shape relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. The residential school system and its legacy must be set in the larger international context of colonial politics that predates the schools and have continued on after their closing. This chapter provides brief introductions to the idea of empire and colonialism, the justifications for imperialism, and the role of education in imperialism. I'm going to stop here. This has been day 2. We're going to move on to empire and colonialism on day 3. This is Cynthia Ganga Soprano with Cynthia Sings Classical. I am Canadian, and I am responsible as a settler for these treaties and what happened to Aboriginal people in Canada. Thank you.